Live.
Welcome to Book Trib's Facebook Live. I'm Ann Carrick. Today's guest is Kim Vidkjær, author of How to F Up Your Startup. So Kim, thanks for being here with us, first of all.
Thank you for having me.
Great to have you. From your bio, we know that you're a multi-time successful entrepreneur with at least one failure, along with being an investor and of course now an author. So why don't you give us the 30-second story of becoming a millionaire and losing it all? Like what happened and what was that business?
Sure. So the journey to becoming a millionaire was actually sort of multiple businesses, but I remember quite distinctly that at day sort of New Year's Day 2007, I sort of did the math on the different companies I've been working in and so on and so forth, and realized that I was now at the point where I could, if I sold all of my assets, I could actually live off the amount of money that I've earned then. And that was a great feeling, and a really sort of classic newspaper headline. And then fast forward 2 years later, I was basically broke. And in that period of time, I'd lost more money than the average American earns in a lifetime. And I did the math on that one. So that was quite the experience, and of course highly unintended, but it did leave me sort of with a good chance, I felt, to sort of study what happens in failures in companies and so on and so forth. So yeah, what are also the mechanisms behind this? And of course, sort of this was of a great personal interest for me, is how to sort of recover from that and how to avoid those failures in the future.
So that failure is what prompted all.
That's sort of my starting point. Yeah.
Okay, but that's what prompted all the research, which ended up in the book.
Definitely, yes. So initially, of course, it didn't start out as a book or an idea for a book. It started out as a personal project, and I wanted to sort of see how can I, basically note down these things, these F-ups that I did on my own part, and make sure to avoid those in the future. And little by little, discussing with other founders and so on and so forth, a pattern emerged.
Okay, so with the big blunder that put you under after being a millionaire, was it sort of one big mistake, or was it a host of mistakes? Now looking back, do you see it as one or a whole bunch of things that you did wrong?
So it was a combination of things. There were some elements of timing, and one big mistake that I did on my part is what I now call sort of plate spinning. So I was doing too many things at the same time. So I was doing a startup within renewable energy. I was the CEO, the new CEO of TBWA, the advertising company in Denmark, and bought a house, beautiful baby daughter, everything happening at the same time.
So
that is
too many plates spinning, and some of them fell on the floor.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. So
luckily the business ones are not the family ones. Yeah.
Yes, definitely. If you have to choose, that's a good good way to go. So speaking of that, you're not just doing one thing now. I mean, yes, you've written a book, but you do more than you're more than just an author. So what is it that what would you consider to be your day job? I know you have Simply CRM, which you can tell people what that is, but what else are you doing on a regular basis at the moment?
Yeah, true. So Simply CRM is my sort of my primary work as it is right now, where we're a CRM platform. And as the name hopefully implies, we're sort of aiming at a target group where you do not need an IT degree to be a user of this platform. So something that's easy to work with and still covers all of the basic features. And that's quite successful, and I'm spending a lot of time on that. But in addition to that, I'm also active as an investor, and I do board work. So those things also, of course, tend to take up some time in my calendar. And investments is typically something in my role, and the people who are doing it in the same way as I am, is an active business. So you are not just, placing money, but you are sort of supposed to be sort of smart capital in the sense that you are offering advice and network and so on and so forth. And that, of course, also takes up a part of the calendar.
Yeah. So it's not just giving them money, but it's also the mentoring and coaching a little bit to help them succeed. And here in the US, I'll say like Shark Tank a little bit, where they invest in the company and then they help them also.
Yes, definitely. Completely same angle. Yep.
Okay. which was going to be a future question I was going to ask about, coaching and mentoring. So I guess the answer is yes, you do do coaching and mentoring. Do you do coaching and mentoring though only for those companies that you're investing in, or do you also do that, if somebody comes to you and says, hey, I could use some help, I'll pay you, can you help me? Do you do that kind of work also?
Occasionally, but normally not. So
Okay.
I tend to spend my time on sort of either companies where I have a direct investment in, or if it's board work related. So if, of course, as a board member, you are essentially helping the company by steering it in terms of strategy or partnerships or new management or whatever the challenge may be. But sort of the classic sort of consulting structure is not something I'm really doing right now. That would have to be a rare case.
Yeah, no, understood. So, we talk about success, failure, exit. If you look at your own businesses over the years, do you have any like best, worst, favorite businesses or stories that go with that?
Yeah, so I've been lucky enough to do a lot of failures along the way, and also lucky enough, of course, that the amount of successes that I've had has outweighed the issues that I've met along the way. But I think definitely one of the businesses that I'm most proud of is actually in Denmark, where we did a company with some partners. So we're a larger founding team, definitely, where we did a renewable energy company. And this was a category that none of us really knew beforehand. So we were just, these eagerly, at that time, young people thinking, this is an existing monopoly, and why not challenge that? And did a renewable energy company. So that's within, solar and wind and so on and so forth. And that was a very long struggle where we almost went bankrupt at several points in our history. But it turned out great, and we became a very large sort of company in Denmark by that measure. And of course, Denmark is a very small country compared to the US, but by Danish standards, quite big. And I think we supplied a few percentage of the total sort of energy in Denmark. So that's quite nice. And we won Apple's data centers and other sort of PR cases like that. So that was quite good.
Now, does that business still exist?
Yeah, but we've sold it, so it's out of our hands. But it's still doing very well. Yeah, definitely.
Well, and that brings up a point. I've heard stories of people who start a business with the intent to sell out and cash in. And sometimes they even target like an industry that has an obvious big player, knowing that company is just going to buy them out to make them go away. Sometimes they do it multiple times. I mean, so have you ever done that yourself? And what do you think about that whole concept?
So I understand definitely why it's tempting to go for, and I'm covering this in the book also. But I have some severe issues with this, and it's not because of sort of the morality of or anything like that. It's just the fact that when you are doing a company, it is going to take you years and years and years before you are at that point where you're actually successful. And sort of, for instance, I've built, of course, a large database of failed companies, and it takes about 3 years before an average company, of course, this would depend on your industry and geography and the founding team and many other factors, but on average, it's going to take you 3 years before you are actually able to produce, non-red numbers. So there is a lot of time in this also. And if you are only aiming for exit, then there are just too many complications along the way. It's okay to have like an exit scenario as one of your scenarios. As an example, for our utility company, we had different scenarios in terms of what would happen further down the road. One scenario definitely was us staying as owners of the company for a long period of time. Another scenario was an IPO. And a third scenario being, of course, that we would sell the company. And there were sort of different variations of these themes. But just going single-minded for the exit is dangerous, basically.
Okay. But as you're saying, it's good to have different exit plans in mind based on different scenarios that could pop up. So that kind of like having, a plan, like if A happens, we'll do B. And if D happens, we're doing F. I mean, so those kind of exit plans you're saying are good, just not going into it thinking I'm going to start a business just to be a pain in somebody's side, so they'll give me a lot of money to go away.
Exactly. And of course, sort of, you need to have a number of different opportunities as you move along, because things, they are changing all the time. The category that you're in would be undergoing some sort of disruption on a regular basis. There are new competitors in the market, new technologies, stuff happening all the time. So you need to have different options as to where you're going to go in the future, and of course revisit those options on a frequent basis, maybe yearly or whatever. So you have different roads to travel on. But having one singular approach is just dangerous in any context, basically.
Well, and you never know exactly what's going to happen. I mean, look at some of the recent news related to new businesses. I mean, Spotify and Theranos. I'm sure neither of those companies, when they started, expected to be dealing with what has happened in recent months. I mean, do you want to comment a little bit on either or both of those? Because those are probably great examples that people have heard about in the news where they did something wrong, and, I'll go out on a limb. If they'd read your book, maybe they wouldn't have done that, but yeah, I mean, let's talk about Spotify, because that one's been in the news recently, and not the political aspect of whether, Joe Rogan should have a podcast there, or should people, pull their podcasts from Spotify, but from the Spotify standpoint, could they have done things better?
Definitely. And I think, everyone would agree by now, sort of in hindsight, 2020, everything like that. So, but they should have sort of the late response, or the lack of action actually that they had regarding expressing concerns over Joe's content. And I don't basically care what anyone says or does on their podcast. That's their right to say and do so. But the fact that they responded so slowly and vaguely was a huge issue, and they were in a position where they were actually getting to a point where they, after a very long period of just losing money day in, day out, was going to be profitable. And suddenly, overnight, they lost billions in market valuation. And that's, that is terrible. And they should have been able to foresee something like that. And of course, there were different issues around this podcast. We first saw these accusations of being, in terms of the vaccine, and then later on in terms of racism and so on and so forth. And of course, when they have thousands of or millions of podcast episodes out there will be stuff like this. And of course, they had to anticipate that this would happen.
They probably could have anticipated this was going to happen, not just with one person, but with anybody, as you're saying.
It
with
was
that
just
many
a matter of time. It had to happen.
Right. Sooner or later, somebody was going to say something that somebody else didn't like. And
exactly.
So the point I guess you're making is, when the first complaints started to be aired, that's when they needed to jump in and either do something or take a stand or make a comment, whatever action they wanted to take. You're saying is they needed to do it at that first complaint, not wait for it to sort of blow up and then try to put out the fire.
Yeah, that's one issue, which would be true for any company, but specifically Spotify also. I can't remember the exact mission statement right now, but they have a mission statement where they are like, they're for the artist and for the audience, and they're like, it's very sort of holistic and quite beautifully written. But it comes across as being something they've written. It's not true to their core values, and so they are sort of over-promising and under-delivering, and that's an issue. So right now they're coming so it doesn't seem genuine, and that's another issue, because we are dealing with artists and people who are culturally interested, and that's the target group, and that is a part of their core value. So if you're going against your core values as a company and what you expect as an audience, that has to be an issue, and it clearly is.
Yeah, and I think the over-promising, under-delivering, that's a mistake that any company should avoid, or even individuals. I mean,
yes, that's supposed to be a no-brainer, but in reality,
you're setting yourself up to fail if you promise more than you can deliver. Like I said, as a person or a company, you've basically now just put yourself in a position where you cannot succeed.
No, it's there's only, you can only lose from that position.
Yeah, exactly. So let's move on to Theranos, because that was a big story that went on for a long time. A lot of money poured into that. you know, what looked like all sorts of science and research and all those kind of things, you know, that you would have thought all their ducks were in a row, so to speak, and yet it just imploded.
Yeah. So this is of course an older case, despite the sort of the sentencing happening very recently. But I love the business idea and how we all wished for this to have been reality. And actually, of course, I do not know Elizabeth, and I've only read about her. So this isn't anything I know anything about. This is just an opinion. But my opinion is that I think that she actually started from a point where she had a firm belief in her case. I don't think she set out to sort of be a fraud and be dishonest. I think that she felt strongly for her case and sort of and this firm belief then sort of was later blurred in the process. And you know, in her opinion, you know, the end would justify the mean and so on and so forth. And so I think that's a big part of the equation. At the same time, of course, her person was sort of heavily tangled in her own narrative of success, with her being featured on the front cover of magazines and so on and so forth, which made this company so much a part of her identity that, you know, failing was less and less of an option. And this is something you see again and again for many founders, and something I've also personally experienced is, you know, that admitting that you were wrong, that you failed, it is so immensely embarrassing, and it's just it gives you physical pain, and so you would do almost anything, in her case definitely almost anything, to avoid that point. Right. So this would be a part of it, and of course it didn't help that she was having a relationship with her COO and so on and so forth. But
that just made it even that much more complicated and bizarre for the outside world to watch. Yeah.
I mean, no startup should do that either, right? So of course there are cases where you are doing a company with your husband or wife or whatever, and that are successful. It exists, but it is dangerous, because you end up, you know, having nothing to talk about at night than your company and so on. So there are a lot of issues with that track also, and she had a big cocktail of F-ups just waiting to happen.
Well, and you know, we kind of breezed over it, but I think one of the things you were saying is, you know, it's a little bit like when people are playing poker, or you like know when to fold. In other words, like, even though if they seem like they're going badly and you're trying to save it, but to be aware enough, or have people who you trust, that if they come to you and say, Kim, I think it's time to like call this one done. And, you know, I guess that's what you would refer to as exit. But in other words, when it's over, whatever it is, it's not working. The ship cannot be saved. The Titanic is going down. Get on the lifeboat. Yeah. And so I'm guessing that's one of the things you address, you know, because that's a key thing, because I think when people are passionate about something and that's why they started their business, you know, it not only does it become part of them, but it's like they had this mission and they just don't want to give up on that, because they are so committed to whatever that company is supposed to be providing to people.
True. And I think that if you're doing your first company, actually I think this was her first company, then a big issue that as a founder you tend to forget is that normally, you know, because in up towards 90% of startups, they actually fail. So this is like the rule of startups, they fail. So you would have to expect to be able to do more than one company. So if you go all in, and going all in would also be, you know, lying to investors, stuff like that. That's definitely going all in. If you're not successful that single time, then you're screwed for the rest of your life, basically, in terms of startup countries, right? But going all in that way is just not. It's a bad strategy. You have to be prepared to be able to do it again. So okay, maybe it didn't work out the first time. I've learned from this, and second time around, okay, now it's going better, and third time around, we're actually getting somewhere. So this is a part of sort of the whole ecosystem of startups, is you have to be aware that in all likelihood you're not going to succeed at the very first time you do it, and at the very least you need to be aware of, you know, the mines that I call them, that you would be stepping on this marathon of startups. So where are they located, and be aware that you shouldn't, you know, bet the farm and risk everything to get to this point.
Yeah, even though people talk about putting their life savings into some company that they're starting, you're saying don't do that on the first one. Are you actually saying that people should sort of start a company as practice, sort of a half expecting that it's not going to turn into anything big?
That they should be aware of the statistics for doing a company. So at the other end of this equation is, of course, that unless you give it everything you have and do your very, very, very best,
then
you're
it
not
won't
going to
work.
succeed.
Yeah.
So and that's my plate spinning incident from earlier on would also be, okay, I can do this, and then at the same time I'm going to do that, and that's not really going to work out. So unless you are 100% dedicated to the things that you're currently doing, and you're not sort of, I have something that I also call for the toilet test. If you're not thinking about your startup idea as frequently as you would visit the toilet, then you might flush it, because it has to be top of mind all the time. This has to be the thing that you're doing and you're focusing on 24/7 basically. So
you have to be dedicated.
If weekend you're not considering your startup, then you're not really doing a startup.
So if you're just dabbling as a hobby, that's not going to work either.
Exactly. I have this great idea, and from my kitchen I'm just going to launch this new design brand for kids or whatever, and then Thursday, Friday I don't have time, but I'm going to be back Monday. Unfortunately, that most likely will fail.
Okay. So how does somebody balance? Where's the balance point between betting the farm, and having enough passion and skin in the game that you're dedicated to actually trying to make it work and succeed?
Yeah. So there are a ton of issues and things to consider in this. So there is no single answer.
Sure.
But definitely, of course, you need to have, and this is going to sound like a cliche, but you need to have, of course, passion for whatever it is you're doing. That is very important. At the same time, I specifically do not advise anyone to go for their passion. You have to look for problems. So find problems that are in the market space, and don't sort of say, oh, I love this or that, or I'm a big fan of tea. I'm not going to go make a tea shop because there are a ton of shops selling tea already. So find a problem of some sort, an actual problem, and then solve that. Of course, it has to be aligned with something that you can see yourself spending a ton of hours on. Sure. And investing a lot of money in also. But careful not to confuse passion with a startup idea.
Yeah, I'd say like a good job, it has to fit with who you are. If somebody is absolutely opposed to something, you don't go get a job in that industry. So the same thing, you don't start a company just because you see a problem that needs to be solved if it's in an area that goes against who you are. So I think what you're saying
in terms of, exactly. So in terms of it has to align with your interest and things that you know about, of course, also is super important. And then at the same time, you
but wait a minute, didn't you start an energy company and you said none of you knew anything about it?
Yeah, that's true. We didn't know anything about the utility company part. It's a very super good question or comment. We did, however, hire an existing senior vice president from another utility company as a part of the owner structure. And we did extensive research in terms of price points and so on and so forth. And our area was renewable energy. So we were the Danish company to sort of break the monopoly within renewable energy. The existing energy companies, they were selling what we would call for black electricity sourced by coal and so on and so forth, and had no real interest in moving on to this new renewable thing because there were no more money to be made from that. And this is, of course, where we had a spot and ensured, of course, that we on the founding team had someone who had actually been working within utilities for 15 years and had a senior vice president level and knew all about, how do we trade energy, for instance, which isn't an easy thing to solve.
So you brought in an expert for the area that you didn't know. Okay.
Yes.
So, well, so you bring up a good point though, about passion, because it sounds like what you're saying is it doesn't necessarily have to be your personal passion, but you have to be passionate about the business you've decided to start on some level. And so then what would you say to people who they think they found a problem, they're going to start a business, but if they're not really into it from a passion standpoint, they just think they're going to make money. They're looking for fortune. Is that a bad idea? Or as long as they're okay with the idea, they can be passionate about being successful, is that enough? Or do they really need to have some passion about the topic?
The thing is that you will be spending so many hours on this, and you of course also need a high level of expertise in the area, or develop a high level of expertise. So let's say, if you have some founders, and I'm going to say founders in plural, because again, the statistics says that you need to be more than one. That will just help you from a ton of angles. But this has to be something where you are also, when you're not working, then you're Googling and reading about this, and sort of, it has to be something that really can sort of get you going. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. And then thinking that this is an easy way to earn money, then that's probably not going to happen, because again, most companies fail.
No matter how good and how prepared you are, how much money you have, you're still fighting that statistic.
Yeah, and that is how it is. And I also know, for instance, from my experience, and I have a friend of mine who actually did a large project on this, that even experienced founders who are then going out and the second time round saying, okay, we've done this, we've cracked it, we've sold a company, we have a ton of money, everything is good. And then they're going to underestimate how hard it actually is. So the second time round, if you had a success the first time, the bad news is the second time round, you are most likely going to do worse than you did on the first time.
Oh, that's not fair.
Despite being more knowledgeable and better funded and everything. So the curve is like this. And, when you hit the third or fourth time, okay, now we're getting somewhere.
Is there a secret for the people who succeeded on the first one, like that 10% that actually succeeded the first time, or were they just lucky?
So there is, of course, luck, and I like to talk about managing your luck. So luck management. But so luck is an element. But of course, if you are aware of the different areas, where you might fail, then that is going to help. So, for instance, the easy examples being, if you select an industry that isn't what I call an idiot industry, then you are most likely in a better position than if you do select an idiot industry. So, opening a flower shop, that is fairly complicated. It's not hard to open a flower shop, but having success with a flower shop is complicated. And when I was young, I dreamt about having a cafe, and that would be so cozy and stuff like that. That is also an industry that is very challenged. So that is also hard.
I know. I always hear restaurants fail more than every other business or something.
Yeah, and the entry barrier is very low, so it's easy to get started, but getting successful is very complicated. And those that are successful are extremely skilled and very diligent at what they do. It's not just making a nice cup of coffee. Right. And so the industry matters a lot. And then, of course, ensuring that you have a strong founding team. So if you look at investment from an investment perspective, the founders is a big part of the secret sauce. So if they, understand what it is they're doing in terms of the product and the industry and so on and so forth, then we're, in a much better position. And typically, you would want someone who has like the business understanding and someone with the product understanding, whatever the product is. And a lot of companies today also have a tech element to it. And if that's the case, then you need someone who knows tech and so on and so forth. So those components definitely need to be in place.
Yeah. I think I have a newfound appreciation for a friend of mine who's had a florist shop for, his whole career, and even had a fire that destroyed the whole building, and he had to move and start over again, and he's still going strong. So he must be doing something right.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And I'm actually, which is a little, I'm picking a lot on florists in my book, but which is a little unfair. But it's easy to conceptualize, saying, I love flowers. There is a shop I can rent over on the corner here, and blah, blah, blah. And everything sounds good until you discover that you only have sales, on Valentine's Day. And the rest of the year, you either have too much stock or not enough. And then if you buy too many, roses or whatever, a week later, you can't sell those roses, right?
Exactly.
Whereas were those jeans, then okay, maybe you can sell them a week later, but not 2 years later.
Exactly.
And so on and so forth. Yeah.
Yeah. That, like, food and flowers don't last long. They're very short life. You have to use them right away.
On all products, basically, lifespans are declining because, also in fashion, it's, some companies will, roll out new collections 5 times a year and so on and so forth. But there are some categories where it's especially hard.
Yeah. So a question about the pandemic. We're heading into the 3rd year. Has this changed the game specifically for startups?
I think that the pandemic has changed sort of the rules we play by for companies as a whole. Of course, there are some categories where things are harder, and there are some categories where it's easier actually. So obviously, again, restaurants have had a hard time. Cafes, it's been very that has been very sad to witness how, great cafes that were maybe not making a ton of money before, but they were alive. And now you have like these for rent signs all over the place. So that's a very sad byproduct of this pandemic. At the same time, there are other categories where, for instance, in my company, Simply CRM, where before the pandemic, we did a lot of customer meetings in person. Not that we actually wanted that, because we were happy doing Zoom calls and stuff like that. But customers would insist on, meeting face to face, and today that doesn't exist anymore. No customers asking for that. So any consultancy or similar type of company where you would otherwise pre-pandemic have to have physical meetings, all of a sudden now maybe you have a global reach. So that has changed, of course, some of the rules. But again, I also have a very small investment in a retail chain. And the shipping cost during the pandemic has added a lot to the pricing there and so on and so forth. So the whole retail category of course has been challenged, but this isn't specific to startups. This is just like,
business in general,
business as it is, the business of business.
Yeah. I mean, and there's a lot of pivoting that's had to go on in every industry to kind of to change how we do things to accommodate. That's for sure.
So we've all learned a lot from this. Of course, one thing that startups tend to do, which is a big plus, is that then where the established players, they are having problems, sometimes that leaves a little opening for startups to get in there and mess things up. So if you have some category, which could also be in retail, for instance, so some of the areas where established players, they have been challenged, that leaves opportunity on the table for startups that may be more aggressive or lighter in terms of cost, or faster, or a combination of all those parameters.
Yeah. Well, and anytime you have a major shift in how things are done, whether it's because of a pandemic or technology or a disaster or whatever, there always opens up new pockets of opportunities for businesses that didn't exist before, because there's a new need, or as you said, a problem. There's new problems that need to be solved. And so that does, I guess, open up doors for people to jump on that and solve that problem.
And of course the key here being look for problems and not your passion, but the problem, and find a good problem and have fun with that, and that could easily turn out to be a successful business.
Find a good problem and then be passionate about solving it.
Exactly. Yes.
Okay. So what do you want readers to take away from the book? Somebody buys the book, they read it. What would you like them to take away afterwards? Yeah.
So I think that first off, of course, I want them to avoid the vast majority of issues that they would otherwise fail on their road down this startup avenue. So this is, again, I refer to this as the marathon in a minefield, doing the startup. And if you know where the mines are located, then at least 80% of the mines you can avoid. Then there would still be mines scattered all over the landscape. But if you're able to avoid the vast majority, then you're in a better position. So being able to survive longer obviously gives you a much better chance of doing so in the long run. So that is actually sort of my key project. And I also think that this is not a zero-sum game. So there is room in the marketplace for a lot of more companies. It's not that 10 more companies would mean that 10 other companies would fail, because if we're able to avoid not having product market fit, for instance, so instead of having companies that are making something based on a great idea with no audience, that's just a waste of resources, of someone's time, money, and so on and so forth. So being able to avoid all of these issues would definitely send a lot of companies off into a better shape. And again, when startups are doing well, what we also see is, of course, is that our economy as a whole is doing better.
Yeah.
I also have a small sort of hope that I have a chapter on one of my FOPs being that called hiring white heterosexual men is an FOP, meaning that I'm also hoping for more diversity. So seeing more female entrepreneurs, seeing a broader diversity as a whole. I would love to see, and that also makes financial sense.
Yeah, instead of middle-aged white men, is that what we're saying?
Exactly. Yes. Hi there. Yep.
Okay. So we are out of time. One quick question as we exit. Do you see you have something new coming up, like on the horizon, that we should be looking out for, aside from, of course, the book, which is, and more books maybe, but, for yourself or businesses, anything new that you want to share with us?
No, actually, I think speaking of Place Playing, I'm good for now. So I've had a lot of fun over the last few years with this book. And so now I'm more into sort of, you're doing speaking engagements and stuff like that around this topic, which I find it super interesting. And the whole idea of, investigating failure, I find immensely interesting and also beneficial. So I think I have my plate full for now.
Okay. Well, Kim Vidkjær, thank you again for being with us. Of course, if you want to find out more about Kim or his book, How to F Up Your Startup, you can visit kimvidkjær.com. And for Book Trip, I'm Ann Carrick. Have a great day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.